Stop the world!
I think the nature of intelligence and the need for analysis of that information, sense-making as opposed to sort of, future forecasting, remains as vital as it ever was. And I think some would even say it's more important now than it ever has been before.
Welcome back to Stop the World, ASPI's new weekly podcast on international affairs and security. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm Steph Tiller.
This week's episode is all about intelligence. Chris Taylor, head of ASPI's Statecraft and Intelligence Program, interviews David Geo, Professor of Intelligence and Security at King's College London.
Chris and David consider the history, evolution and future of intelligence. They discuss the use of intelligence during the Cold War, the lessons learned during that period, and how those lessons can help address the challenges we face today.
I do think we stopped looking for some of those lessons for a long time, and only now, with sort of revanchist Russia and great power competition, are we busying ourselves looking for better answers.
Chris also asks David about the impacts of technology on intelligence collection and analysis, the advantages and disadvantages of the democratization of intelligence, and the ongoing importance of human intelligence.
Information is so commercially available. I think the real name of the game now is analysis. It's not who knows anymore. We can all see what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
And if you're interested in intelligence in the Australian context, read ASPI's latest publication, Australia's 2024 Independent Intelligence Review, Opportunities and Challenges. In the lead up to the release of the 2024 Independent Intelligence Review, this compilation of articles explores the challenges and opportunities facing Australian intelligence in the decade ahead. We'll link to the report in the episode notes, but for now, over to Chris and David.
David Geo is Professor of Intelligence and Security at King's College London. He's also an Associate Professor of History at the US Military Academy at West Point, co-convener of the Cambridge Security Initiative, and the co-author of The CIA and the Pursuit of Security and An International History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most recently, he co-edited Great Power Cyber Competition, Competing and Winning in the Information Environment. Prior to completing his PhD at Cambridge, David served in the US intelligence community for over a decade, including with the FBI and the CIA. Most pertinently, David is one of the world's most insightful commentators on espionage. I'm Chris Taylor, head of ASPI's Statecraft and Intelligence Centre, and I'm delighted that David is joining us today on the ASPI podcast, Stop the World. David, welcome to ASPI.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. And before we get started, I should just add the standard US government disclaimer. This is the thoughts of Dave Geo alone and not the government or the Department of Defense.
That's terrific. Thank you for that, because we're here for your opinions, not for the opinions of the US government.
well, as I've said before, they should agree with my opinions, but they don't always.
To start with, David, isn't spying an anachronism? We live in a world of seemingly total information abundance, a world in which nothing's secret, and if it is, it doesn't stay secret for long. Why do governments still value intelligence? How does it empower them?
That's a lot of questions,
artfully
yes. Put into into one question. But I think every country seeks decision advantage, and that's not going to change. And so if we go back to first principles, what's the purpose of intelligence? It's to narrow the cone of uncertainty to support statecraft, as you well know, to support military operations, to prevent strategic surprise, and of course, from a counterintelligence perspective, to protect our own secrets. And so I think maybe we could say that the character of intelligence is changing in the world, as you point out, of information abundance. But I think the nature of intelligence and the need for analysis of that information, sense-making as opposed to sort of, future forecasting, remains as vital as it ever was. And I think some would even say it's more important now than it ever has been before.
So if it's more important now than it ever has been, and there's a utility to some forms of intelligence, where does that leave what I think people often understand intuitively as kind of their stereotypical form of intelligence, that is human intelligence, the cultivation and recruitment of spies? How does HUMINT need to adapt to changes in technology, in society, in international relations?
Human clearly has to adapt, but if I had a nickel for every human obituary that I've read about how human is either going to be replaced by, abundant open source information, or alternatively, you can just hack for all your secrets. So why do you even need humans? I'd be a rich man. But, the premise of your question is, of course, correct. Human does need to adapt to the world around it. It's no doubt challenged by things like ubiquitous technical surveillance, UTS. But, I think that sort of overstates the case. It might be true in certain cities, in certain countries. But overall, I think, we probably don't need to sort of shake in our boots too much just yet about ubiquitous technical surveillance. It's a big world out there, and there's a lot of places where intelligence collection from a human perspective can and does go on. But I also want to just look at the upsides for a second, because technology really has enabled human in all kinds of ways. And in fact, if you go on the CIA's website and you search for jobs, they actually have one now called the digital targeter or something along those lines. But that person basically, helps case officers in the world, find people who might have placement and access to the things that we care about. And then maybe if they have a social media profile or they post on various platforms, you can actually get to know an awful lot about another human being before you ever meet them in person. And so the efficiency gains for a case officer are just remarkable. And I go back to my old boss who used to love these little aphorisms. And he used to say, well, you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince. You just meet a random person on the street or at an event, and who are you and what do you have access to and where do you work and what do you like and all that. Or you have to turn over a lot of stones, to find your prized agent. And the digital world helps us do that. And the final thing I would be remiss is CIA is, I think all intelligence agencies, China and Russia, of course, as well, are hunting for sources on the internet. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, or I guess it's re-invaded Ukraine in 2022, by my last count, CIA has made 2 Telegram, the app Telegram, right, the sort of messaging app. They've made 2 commercials basically inviting Russians to get in touch. And they even have if you go on the MI6 website, it even says, if you want to get in touch with us, here's how to, and then it sort of explains how to use the dark web or the onion router or something. So it's actually telling people how they can securely get in touch. So, are there scary downsides, to the digital world and how that challenges cover for action and cover for status and who am I and what am I doing and what's my real name and what's my cover legend? Sure. But the upsides for human intelligence operations are pretty cool as well.
Cool. Well, you mentioned the R word. You mentioned Russia. We're now over 2 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and both the invasion and aftermath have heralded new technology-driven developments in intelligence. Democratization of what were once major power monopolies over imagery intelligence and signals intelligence. Deployment of, and I note often dueling, open source intelligence analyses, to name just a few examples. In fact, you've written that these, and I'll quote you here, quote, developments represent nothing less than a technologically enabled step change in intelligence in warfare, end quote. Is this indeed the future of intelligence? And how should Western intelligence agencies be adapting their organizations and their capabilities in response?
It's a great question, and it involves everything from recruitment, retention, training, background, technology, all of that stuff, you name it. But I think sort of one disclaimer is in order. And when you talk about OSINT or democratized intelligence, the thing that immediately students go to is Bellingcat, right? If you look up OSINT in the dictionary, there's just a picture of Christo Grozev or Bellingcat. And so, I just want to be a little bit cautious for students or listeners who think, well, OSINT is so powerful that it does all these things. And of course, Bellingcat actually, they use the dark web. They have people that give them tips. They purchase information that you and I can't purchase. You know, they have the registration of Moscow license plates and that kind of thing. So, you know, when we talk about OSINT, or I don't think everybody is going to be Bellingcat. That aside, I think that social media in particular has brought people closer to the war in Ukraine in particular than ever before in human history. You know, and there's a sort of visceralness, I think. You know, if you look at what President Zelensky has done, especially over the first 2 years of the war, to rally support in the West. And it's hard to scroll past, you know, if the Russians are bombing maternity wards, you know, you can't help but sort of be taken in by the human tragedy of that. And so, you know, in the old days, you could read some sterile assessment, you know, from an intelligence leader that says, you know, we assess the Russians are evoking terror in Ukraine by bombing maternity wards or whatever. And that strikes you one way. But, you know, seeing social media pictures of this and then hearing those kinds of assessments, I think really do make a difference. I also think that, you know, when we talk about democratization, we go from rich states or powerful states or great powers right down to, like, you know, the you and me level. Yeah. And we're sort of missing the rest of the world in that equation. So I think the democratization of intelligence, you know, who gets to know what and when do they get to know it? It's not just for people, it's for smaller states as well. Because, you know, in the old days, you know, as you well know, how many countries can afford to have a YouTube program? How many can afford to have satellites? How many can afford to have arrays of satellites? How many can afford to have exquisite SIGINT and to process that and translate it from all over the world? With the democratization of intelligence, you know, it's far less expensive to collect. It's far less resource intensive to collect. In fact, when the Russian reinvasion in 2022 was kicking off, I think it was Apple Maps showed a traffic jam on the way to Kyiv because the Russian columns were stacked up on those highways. Nowadays, people are using the FIRMS, which I think is Fire Information Management something software, because you can look at explosions in Ukraine the way in which you would use the technology to look for forest fires. And so there's all of these different ways in which both people, individual analysts, you know, people with their own Substacks, people who are writing online, you know, people who are tweeting, the Institute for the Study of War, think tanks. There's so much more good analysis out there that it really does sort of, I think, force the intelligence community, the Anglo-American intelligence community, if you like, to bring their A game, because you know, policymakers don't want to hear what they saw on Twitter earlier in the day or they read in somebody's Substack. And because information is so commercially available, I think the real name of the game now is analysis. It's not who knows anymore. We can all see what Russia is doing in Ukraine. You can see the sorts of things that are happening. So the question then becomes, what does it mean? What does Putin have planned? And when will there be another mass mobilization? And these sort of broader questions that we ask beyond the battlefield. But of course, they matter because, you know, Putin, I think, has lost as many people. The U.S. intelligence community estimated months ago that Putin had over 300,000 casualties. Not all of those, of course, were killed. But you see certain things that are happening on the battlefield. And it's not just the U.S. intelligence community, right? Lots of people have their own counts. Oryx has an order of battle count. And when you see this kind of thing, I think those of us sort of inside the skiff, you know, or those on the inside, really have to bring their A game from an analytical perspective because it's such a crowded field now.
So I suppose in addition to that sense making that you talked about and finding those insights, there's also the interesting question about putting intelligence to use. And I suppose a notable development that's come out of the Ukraine experience has been what the US government calls strategic declassification. That is the declassification and public release of secret intelligence to generate influence and effect over other international actors. And obviously that included the release of intelligence in January and February of 22 to try and deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the US has since gone very public about its willingness to apply the same techniques beyond the Ukraine. From your perspective, what are the opportunities and challenges of engaging in strategic declassification? Do you see other countries doing similar in the future, following that lead from the US?
It's a great question because it's a sort of novel development. There's a prehistory to it that goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as I was researching this topic, actually the Reagan administration loved strategic declassification, which is something I didn't.
The downing of that Korean airliner, for example.
Right. That's right. And also, so I guess just for your listeners, the Soviets denied that they had shot down Korean Airlines, I think 007 in maybe 1983. And then the Reagan administration had the U.S. ambassador to the UN play the tapes of the Soviet fighter pilots shooting it down. So, once you bring the receipts, it's hard to deny it. They also did it, just, I guess, of interest, when the Libyans bombed the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin, killed 2 U.S. troops and I believe a lady from Turkey. And so the NSA intercepted, and actually sort of sensitive, but your question asked about using intelligence. The Reagan administration intercepted some diplomatic cables from the Libyan embassy, their so-called People's Bureau, congratulating themselves on what a good job they did. So Reagan was a fan. And I mentioned this just to say that, there is a prehistory. But I think what's new is that, if you take the Biden administration and the war in Ukraine, they've tried to pre-bunk, right, or issue pre-buttals for Russian lies. And they've tried to kind of, get ahead of the Russian narrative instead of always being in respond mode. I do think sometimes we ask too much of strategic declassification, right? Like, was this ever going to deter Putin?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Strategic declassification or strategic downgrades, it's a powerful tool, but it can't overcome, years of insufficient pushback on the Russians.
It's not a magic bullet.
It's not a magic bullet. After Crimea, what did we do? Practically nothing. Years of not giving the Ukrainians enough security assistance, military aid. So there's only so much that it in and of itself can accomplish. I mean, like anything, like a foreign policy, like covert action, a whole of government approach, consistently focused over time, right, is what gets you results, not, hey, we know what you're going to do. But your question is absolutely right about applying it beyond Ukraine. We've now seen, Bill Burns, the CIA director, publicly say, I think on a TV interview, that the Chinese were considering providing lethal aid to the Russians, and then they didn't cross that line. So, okay, well, was it the, hey, we know what you're thinking that did it, or were they not ever going to do it? So it's trying to parse out, what does the strategic declassification do in the midst, right, of all of these other things? We've seen it in Israel. You may remember when there was an errant rocket from, I want to say, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist group that hit a hospital in Gaza. The media and others were quick to say, oh, this was an Israeli bomb. This is what they did. And the U.S. intelligence community kind of came out relatively quickly and said, actually, no, this is an errant Palestinian rocket. And, of course, then what's the point, right? Is the point to sort of buy Israel a little bit of time, or is it to just correct the record, right? So what's the political, sort of motivation behind it? And then I think the last thing I would want to say particularly, is that intel chiefs, you asked about, is the U.S. sort of the thin edge of the wedge, right? And are other people going to be doing this? And you definitely see intelligence chiefs who are increasingly seeking out the microphone. Just a couple of examples. I saw the Estonian intelligence chief basically saying, hey, we're next, once the Russians are done. We don't need to get into the merits of whether that's true or not. But the point is, you have an intel chief sort of speaking with the credibility, the gravitas, the seriousness, right? Because the intel people aren't supposed to be the policy people. They're supposed to be the people that know things.
Yep.
We see the Ukrainian HUR chief, Lieutenant General Budanov, talking a lot, you might say, for an intel chief. He talked about the Crocus City Hall ISIS terrorist attack. So, you do see more and more intel chiefs seeking out the microphone. I think, though, that there's a downside to that, which is that you're sort of mortgaging the credibility of the intel community, right? Because if they do it too much, then they'll just be seen as yet another policy official. No different.
They'll lose some of that specialness.
They'll lose some of that, right? Because what is the magic thing that intelligence has, right? It has apolitical objectivity, right? And that's a reputation that you earn over years, and you could squander in a really short amount of time. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I thought Putin was so stupid for invading Ukraine, because I thought we and the US, and the Brits were running around telling everyone in the world, this is what's going to happen. The Russians are going to invade, and they had it pretty close, even down to the timing. And I always thought, Putin really missed a trick here, because what he should have done was recall the absolute beating from pundits, the media, academics, the public, after the wrong call about Iraq WMD in 2003, where the community was just dragged through the coals, numerous investigations in the US and the UK. All Putin needed to do to really damage, right, his main enemy, right, his arch adversary, the US and the British intelligence communities, was just to pull back from Ukraine and say, see, it was only an exercise. I told you it was only an exercise. You guys didn't believe me. You cried wolf. You totally put your credibility on the line, and you were wrong. And then after the beating that the US intelligence community and the British intelligence community would have gotten, then he could have just gone and invaded a year later, So I really think he missed an opportunity there to hold the intelligence community's feet to the fire. Because once you're public with that assessment, all that is what it's a snapshot in time, right? It's their best estimate of what's going to happen at that fixed point in time. It's not what's going to happen necessarily. So I think he screwed that one up, because he could have sort of played or fought back against strategic declassification by being like, great, I've got you guys on record. I have you just where I want you. Now I'm going to go home for a little while. Anyway.
Well, David, that's why you're so crafty.
That's right.
But you're also an historian, and I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned a number of instances there, the role of strategic declassification in a Cold War context. I wanted to talk actually a bit more broadly about intelligence in the Cold War. It was obviously an integral feature of the Cold War as a contributor to greater strategic competition, but even as a sort of theatre of contest itself. And again, to quote you, you've written that, quote, intelligence was, in several senses, crucial to the development of the Cold War superpower nuclear arms race, end quote. 3 decades on from the end of the Cold War, do you think there are enduring lessons from that historical experience for the conduct of intelligence today and maybe tomorrow?
Well, I'm an intelligence historian, as you mentioned. I'm also an applied historian.
The best kind of historian.
Well, that's obviously the best kind of historian to be. So, you won't be surprised if I say that, yes, absolutely, there are many lessons to be learned. And I think, your question about the nuclear arms race in particular is pertinent, because the Cold War kicks off itself with an intelligence success for Stalin to so thoroughly have penetrated the Manhattan Project, the creation of the atomic bomb. The Soviets tested their own nuclear device called Joe-1 by 1949, several years before U.S. estimates. I think U.S. estimates had it maybe in the early to mid-1950s. So when the Soviets do this, right, and it's all based on espionage. They steal everything that's not nailed down. They've got agents through, the British version is Tube Alloys. They've got Klaus Fuchs, they've got David Greenglass, the Rosenbergs, they have all of these people who are stealing U.S. nuclear research. And so, of course, the flip side of a Soviet intelligence success would be an Anglo-American intelligence failure. Right. So we did not satisfactorily protect those secrets. So what does this do? I think this has the effect of enabling Stalin to sort of carve out his own sphere of influence, because once we realize, I think that the status of Central Europe after 1945 was not entirely settled. But after we learned that the Soviets have their own nuclear weapon, that kind of settles it, right? Because nobody wants to kick off World War III, this time with nukes. And so Stalin is sort of left to his own devices. I think it's also, an analytical failure on the part of the US and the UK, because they assessed that Stalin would want to regroup and sort of, just take a minute, rebuild, consolidate his own power. And he didn't, so we kind of read that wrong. He was inherently an expansionist leader. So we, again, not just collection, but assessment. I think we got that a bit wrong. And then I think moving along to your question, the Cold War has so much to teach us. And, the irony, or I guess the sad part is, once we I know Francis Fukuyama gets a beating about, the end of history and all that, but I do think we stopped looking for some of those lessons for a long time, and only now with sort of revanchist Russia and great power competition are we busying ourselves looking for better answers.
I suppose one of the features of that new world is a kind of resurgent interest in matters deterrence. I'm particularly interested in what you think we can glean from the historical experience about how intelligence services contribute to deterrence and by extension to the avoidance of open conflict.
I think this is your hardest question, Chris.
Well, that's why I asked it, David. I need to know this answer.
Well, I don't want to be the guy that questions the question, but I will a little bit.
You're the guest. That's your prerogative.
What do they say in wargaming, right? Don't fight the white, just play the game as it's meant to be played. But, I think things that we do in secret, it's hard to sort of assess the deterrent value if the other guy doesn't know that we're doing it.
Yes.
So from a covert action point of view, keeping the Cold War cold by having hotter wars or covert action in other places, sure. Covert action in Afghanistan in the 1980s, I think, certainly played a key role in weakening the Soviets. I think where the real value was from an intelligence point of view is that intelligence was contributing to understanding less than deterring, which in the West, helped us to resolve the Cold War peacefully. And I always think of President Reagan, who benefited so greatly from the secret insights that were gleaned by the British penetration of the KGB, Colonel Oleg Gordievsky. And so, during Reagan's first term, if you look at his rhetoric, it was all about, the ash heap of history and we will bury you and evil empire. Yep. And he's a very, very, sort of combative person. Able Archer, the nuclear war game in 1983 that was almost too realistic, and freaked out the Soviets. And, so when people ask me all the time, well, okay, these spy stories are great, but, what difference does it really make? I love to tell the story of Gordievsky, because, he told MI6, hey, the Soviets think that the Americans are actually going to strike first, and they're pretty scared of Reagan's offensive policy, perceived offensive policy, I guess, but certainly his military buildup, and the Strategic Defense Initiative and all that. And so MI6 then briefs Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher on Gordievsky's insights. And as I'm sure you know, she had a very close relationship with Reagan. Yep. She goes to Reagan and she's like, hey, all of your rhetoric is scaring the hell out of the Soviets. And Reagan was shocked to think that he could actually be perceived by the Soviets as the guy that would actually order the destruction of the world, yep. Through a nuclear exchange. And so if you look in Reagan's second term, you see a more conciliatory tone. You see the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev. And so together, they can sort of help deal with the final decade of, and really the final maybe, call it 5-6 years of the Cold War. And so that's based on intelligence insights, gained from a penetration of the other side. But before you ask, and here's where the pracademic in me kicks in, it would be fair of you to say, well, then surely it would be okay for the Soviets to penetrate the U.S. intelligence community to know that the U.S. didn't have any real designs, in terms of a nuclear first strike, and then I have to, play the practitioner shrug card, because no, it's that would not be okay. So, I guess that's the hard part about being an academic and a practitioner, is it's clear that the Gordievsky case and others like it helped Reagan and Thatcher, sort of manage the closing most dangerous years of the Cold War. But no, it would not be okay in reverse.
Well, you're ensuring that balance there between the practical and the academic. I have a question for you about balance, because it is a constant struggle, I think, on the part of intelligence agencies, intelligence communities, about getting the balance right on transparency. on the one hand, and as John Blaxland in an Australian context has observed, for agencies, the secret of success lies in keeping one's successes secret. On the other hand, it's apparent from the relative openness of figures like CIA Director Burns and MI6's Chief Richard Moore, as well as their Australian counterparts, that agencies do see value in moving at least tentatively out of the shadows. You've been an observer on both sides of the Atlantic, of the USIC and the UKIC, and their approaches in this regard. What do you think are their relative strengths and weaknesses? And should we expect this newfound transparency to continue or perhaps even increase?
I'm a fan of transparency, and I'm a fan of those efforts. And the U.S. intelligence community, I think more so than the other Five Eyes, we do talk a good game about transparency. The questions, I think, are transparency of what? Is it
yes.
Is it who are we, right? How many people do we have, right? Several years ago, the intelligence budget was classified in the U.S. The intelligence budget was classified, and then I don't exactly know, but several years ago, it was inadvertently said, and then they realized that that I guess the world didn't end, and now on the DNI's own website, they say something like nearing $100 billion or something, and they even separate it out to the military intelligence program, the national intelligence program. There's much more transparency there. Does that help anything? I don't know, but it's a step in the right direction. There's transparency about the legal regimes and our authorities. And here I'm a big believer in transparency so long as it doesn't, of course, jeopardize sources or methods. Or the more squishier one is to, you never want to give agents, prospective recruited agents, the idea that, you're kind of loosey-goosey with intelligence because they just don't like intelligence in the public sphere, right? At the end of the day, it's their safety and security on the line. So that's a hard one to kind of reconcile. What I don't like is transparency when we could have done better in the first place, or maybe forced transparency. So if you look at, for instance, the rather devastating Snowden leaks in 2013, that was transparency forced on the intel community by a reckless mass leaker. And then in response, the U.S. government and the intelligence community, they released a lot of the legal regimes, some of the legal findings. They even had 60 Minutes come to NSA headquarters, talk with the director, General Keith Alexander. The deputy director of NSA gave a TED talk. All of these things are good things, but doing it in response to a mass leak means that you don't really get any bonus points.
It's very reactive.
It's very reactive. You don't get any bonus points for saying, hey, we live in a democracy. You guys, your taxes go to support this. Your husbands, wives, daughters, sisters, sons, brothers, you all are part of the intelligence community. And so it's important that as an American people, how these people, either in uniform or civilians, or the FBI, how they contribute to your security, how they contribute to statecraft, and how they contribute to your prosperity in terms of decision advantage. And they didn't do any of that. It was no such agency and, never say anything, the NSA initials until Snowden. And so I think the best thing that you could do is to get ahead of, mass leaks that, Snowden and his media partners really mischaracterized what was going on. But because they were speaking against nothing, right? It was a totally open space because there was no counter narrative. Then, as you say, it was totally reactive. And I think the community didn't do a good job. And I think teaching students every day, they are skeptical of anything to do with power and power relationships. And secrecy is a form of power. Knowledge is a form of power. Secret knowledge is something that powerful people have and that powerful agencies collect. And so, saying, well, there's no comment, or I can neither confirm nor deny, or any of this stuff, that might have worked in our day as a sort of, that's a club with a mystique, and I want to be part of that mysterious club. It doesn't work for students now. You have to, I think we as, academics and, those of us with one foot in at least, have to do a better job meeting people, and especially the young people who ultimately are, they're voters, they're taxpayers, and they're our pool of recruits. So we have to do a better job meeting them where they are.
David, you've been enormously generous with your time and your insights. I do have one last question for you. You've experienced the world of espionage from a 360-degree perspective as observer and as participant. One oddity of that world is that it's overshadowed by its representation in popular culture, as you just talked about. That's unusual for government work because no one's making a 7-part Netflix series about life in the patent office or a feature film about land management. And it's sometimes akin to the representation displayed by a funhouse mirror. Would you be able to suggest for our listeners some examples from popular culture, it can be screen or page, that even if they don't get the business of intelligence 100% right, nonetheless have some educational value, and why?
This is my least favorite question, Chris, because, by the time Hollywood is done with misinforming students or, executives, and then they come to King's or wherever, and they want to learn about intelligence, it's almost like refinishing a piece of furniture, like your bookshelf, right, or your dresser drawer that's wood that has been painted over and refinished 1,000 times, that there's a million layers of bubbly, terrible-looking paint before you get to it. And so my job, I think, as an intelligence historian or a scholar of intelligence, especially one who teaches, is to kind of try to sand down all of the Hollywood nonsense to try to get to that basic level of wood again. But if you really push me on it.
Oh, I'm going to push you.
If you really push me on it, I don't think there's much out there.
Okay.
I'm not the kind of person that, says, well, you ever watch a war movie like with a veteran or something? Like, no, they never would have used that squad automatic weapon. Like, all right, just enjoy the movie, right? Like, let it go. So I'm not that kind of person. But I would say that there's a couple sort of popular touch points. Number one is actually John Le Carre as what not to do.
Right.
Because Le Carre sort of has this, I guess I think that, the Western intelligence communities are morally better than authoritarian intelligence communities because they exist as the first line of defense for innocent people or for their country, not to repress people or to keep regimes in power. That's not their job. And I think the tricky part with Le Carre, is that everything is a shade of gray and there's no good guys and there's no bad guys. And it's all just, you could switch, KGB headquarters and CIA headquarters, and it would essentially be just the same thing, right? Just serving a different power. And so, I think I like to use Le Carre as a sort of example of what I think is not true, right? That there is a moral clarity to intelligence. There is a code of ethics. In terms of the dedication of intelligence officers and what they risk and putting the mission first, Zero Dark 30 has a lot of sort of factual problems with it, but the dedication of the teams who are out there trying to find bin Laden, right, putting themselves second or last and putting the team first and putting the mission first. And so you see that dedication from those people. And so I think that's well represented. And look, I didn't have kids, when I was a serving officer, but I like to watch The Americans, about the Russian illegals, because what do you tell your kids? How old are they when they can deal with the secret? And how do you trust sort of the family's safety and security, and by proxy your agent's safety and security? At what age do you convince kids that they need to keep secrets and that, they're on the team, right? And mom and dad have a secret. So I think The Americans, kind of hints at some of those family dynamics that can be pretty interesting. But I'll close with a plug for some really great documentaries. And I think Netflix does have one called Spy Ops now that kind of tells some of the greatest hits. HBO, has a series on intelligence. So, if people are looking for things that are both informative as well as entertaining, I actually think some of the documentaries are just as exciting. I don't read fiction, and my wife thinks this is crazy. She's like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you read fiction? And the truth is that, I think I guess I work in my hobby. I really only read books about intelligence or intelligence studies or things that have happened in the world that intelligence has had a bearing upon. And I think I do it because, to me, that's the most interesting thing. There's nothing that a Hollywood writer could think up then it's more dramatic than raising a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean, or any of these things. So I'll plug entertaining documentaries where people can both be entertained and learn something at the same time.
That's fabulous. Thank you, David, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris.
That's all we have for you this week on Stop the World. If you have any feedback on the new podcast, we'd love to hear from you at podcast@aspi.org.au.
And be sure to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.